My name is Wendy Perlman. I am the interim director of the Middle East and North Africa Studies program and introducing the event today on behalf of my colleagues in the Crown Center and the Buffett Institute. Thank you. This is our fourth installment in our series exploring early history of Israel and Palestine. It would today feel a bit like the elephant in the Zoom room if I didn't acknowledge that as we speak, we have Northwestern students who are just a few feet away from me here, protesting with demands related to the war that has now passed its 200th day. We hope that our series can help shed light on how we got here and help offer information that can empower everyone with crucial understanding and context. Can everyone hear that? The sirens outside my door here in Scott Hall. As I was saying, we think this series is a really important in this moment, perhaps more than ever, to shed light on how we got here, to help empower everyone in our community with crucial information and context to understand what is happening both in the region and right here on Northwestern's campus. For those who aren't able to make it today, this video, like videos of all of our talks, will be available on the Buffett website and on the Buffett Institute's YouTube channel. So just a bit of recap. In our first lecture, Professor Awad Halabi analyzed religious coexistence in late Ottoman Palestine, as well as growing sectarian conflict after World War I. Then Professor Aryeh Dubnov examined different strands of Zionist thought and mobilization, beginning in 19th century Europe. Then last week, Professor Elizabeth Thompson walked us through what she called 3 phases of violence during World War I in the Levant: the violence of the war itself, the violence of the peace that European powers imposed, and the violence of the colonial mandates that established French rule over Syria and Lebanon, and British rule over Iraq, Transjordan, and Palestine. So today we turn to the Arabs of Palestine and their national consciousness and mobilization as Palestinians in this era. For this topic, we could not ask for a better guide. Joining us from Amman, Jordan, is Dr. Nadim Bawalsa, a historian of modern Palestine and author of Transnational Palestine: Migration and the Right of Return Before 1948. This 2022 book, and I think there's going to be a link to it in the chat, won not one, but 2 of the most prestigious awards in Middle East studies: the Palestine Book Award and the Middle East Studies Association's Nikki Keddie Award. So this is like winning an Oscar and an Emmy in this year. For those of you who are not in Middle East Studies to know what a big deal this is. Nadim serves as associate editor for the Journal of Palestine Studies, and he's on the editorial committee of Al-Shabaka, the Palestine Policy Network. He holds an MA from Georgetown, and he is the first of our next 3 speakers, all of who form a posse of PhDs in history from NYU. Yeah, you guys are kind of taking over our series. Maybe you guys should have been our 4th co-sponsor, is the New York University History Department. So please look for the link in the chat box to fill out our feedback form, both for this event and for our earlier events, if you happen to get those and did not yet fill out a feedback form. And we'll use the Q&A box. So please submit a question in the Q&A box anytime to submit questions for this session after Nadim's presentation. So thank you so much for being here, and Nadim, take it away.
Thank you so much, Wendy. So good afternoon and good evening from Amman. I'm so sorry I couldn't be with you all in person as planned, but recent events in our beloved region are making that a bit difficult. Many flights are no longer flying over Jordan, so 2 of the flights I would have taken to the US, the 2 options flights they gave me were also canceled. So thankfully we have Zoom, and we're well used to it since COVID times. So thank you to Northwestern and the different departments involved for organizing this very important series, and a special thank you to Professor Wendy Perlman for inviting me to speak about the foundations of Palestinian nationalism. It's an honor to be here, especially on this very important day as the students at Northwestern take over with their encampment. So in the next 45 minutes or so, I'll try to speak about some of these foundations as the lecture's titled, and many questions might arise for you, so I invite those, of course, during the Q&A. So the main question, when, how, and why did Palestinians begin to see themselves as a political or a national collective? This question has interested scholars and ideologues for decades, whether bent on proving that Palestinian identity only emerged in its confrontation with Zionism, and therefore that it's a fabrication that came after Zionism, or on proving exactly the opposite, that Palestinian identity had always existed in geographic, linguistic, political, and cultural manifestations, irrespective of Zionism. Whatever the motivation, the debates and the disagreements abound and are arguably moot at this point, while we Palestinians are literally fighting to not be erased. That said, let us consider the question as an exercise in historical inquiry. When, how, and why did Palestinians begin to see themselves as a political national collective? Like all nationalisms, Palestinian nationalism must be understood as complex and changing, influenced by internal dynamics, especially class, as well as external ones like colonialism and competing nationalisms. Importantly, though, nationalism is by definition exclusionary, setting one group apart from another. So it necessitates a binary or even binaries. And in the case of Palestine, the binary has primarily been Zionism, but also Ottomanism, Arabism, Hashemitism, and several others. But unlike many nationalisms that emerged in the region, Palestinian nationalism hasn't materialized into a nation state. But its rich history before 1948, which I'll try to unpack for us today, suggests key themes in the emergence and progression of Palestinian political consciousness and mobilization since the early 20th century. Hopefully, some of these will become clearer throughout the next 45 minutes or so. Let's see. So let's begin when it was all Ottoman Greater Syria. Palestinian nationalism emerged in the same climate from which other regional nationalism emerged, and for the same reasons. The achievement of national self-determination, namely from the Ottoman Empire, and later from European colonial powers. With the age of traditional empires waning throughout the 19th century, and with the Ottomans growing increasingly unpopular among residents of the shrinking empire, alternatives to centralized dynastic rule that was based in Istanbul began to emerge across Ottoman lands. Whether in Greece, the Balkans, Egypt, or Greater Syria, populations of Ottoman subjects began to strategize and negotiate their political affiliations with Istanbul, weighing the pros and cons of secession, starting a century before the dissolution of the empire in 1918. So what did Ottoman Palestine look like on the eve of the rise of Zionism in Europe in the latter half of the 19th century? First and foremost, it was the southern district or province of Greater Syria, or Bilad al-Sham in Arabic, a historic and geographic region of the Eastern Mediterranean, which today includes the states of Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Israel, and Jordan. This narrow stretch of land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, the tail end of the Fertile Crescent, has long been known as Palestine. Based on Ottoman censuses conducted at the turn of the 20th century, Ottoman Palestine consisted of the Sanjaks of Akka, or Acre, and Nablus within the state of Beirut, as well as the autonomous district known as the Mutasarrifat of Jerusalem, a special administrative or Ottoman administrative demarcation created in 1872 to include Jerusalem, Jaffa, Bethlehem, Hebron, Be'er Sab'a or Beersheba, and Gaza. It was dissolved upon Britain's occupation of Palestine in December 1917. The population of the two Sanjaks and the Mutasarrifat, which are here marked in the two Sanjaks in yellow, as well as the bottom one in orange in geographic Palestine. The population of these three districts of southern Syria was approximately 600,000 in 1900, and historians estimate that about 10,000 residents of this small region had immigrated to the Americas by the start of World War I in 1914. There were, of course, tens of thousands more from Lebanon, Syria, and elsewhere in the region. I talk more about these migrants in my book, but I mention them now because they were as engaged in debates surrounding loyalty to the Ottomans or national self-determination and independence as their compatriots were in Greater Syria. And I want to give us an example of this just to get a sense of just how global this discussion around should we secede, should we stay loyal, how do we identify, these questions of national identity were so global amongst peoples of all empires around this time. So as an example, in early October 1912, an article was published in El Zaman, an Arabic newspaper based in Argentina. The article was titled, "Who Are We and What Are We Called?" And it was reprinted a couple of weeks later in the famous Jaffa-based newspaper Palestine, or Palestine in Arabic, established 1 year prior in 1911. The article, which was written by the Arabic community, or the Arabic-speaking community, I should say, in Argentina, Syrian migrants consisting of Lebanese, Syrian, and Palestinians, all at the time considered Ottoman subjects, and Syrian Arabs. The article described an incident that occurred among migrants in Chile regarding their community's preferred mode of identification. The editors of the newspaper, Palestine newspaper in Palestine, had the following to say to their readers in Palestine on the topic. We see that the right decision was made by the immigrants of the District of Palestine because they requested to be addressed as Ottomans, no more and no less, and not as Turkish, Syrian, or Palestinian, which separates the hearts rather than unifying them. The example says a great deal about this moment in late Ottoman history. First, the empire's defeat, which happened just 6 years later, wasn't evident in 1912, even among its non-Turkish subjects in the years leading up to the war, or at least it wasn't evident to Philistine newspapers' editors, who were clearly Ottomanists or loyals at this time. Secondly, Palestine was seen as its own district, inclusive of the Sanjaks and the Mutasarrifin. After all, the country's main newspaper was named Palestine. And thirdly, the terms Turkish, Syrian, and Palestinian were already in circulation as political identifiers for folks in the region, as well as migrants from the region as far away as Chile and Argentina. In other words, identifying politically as Palestinian was already an option, just not yet a favorable one in 1912. But this reluctance to separate from a greater collective made perfect sense. There were arguably no political, economic, or strategic benefits for residents of southern Syria to begin seeing themselves as Palestinians, separate from northern Syria, or western Syria, known as Lebanon, or any other part of Greater Syria. In fact, there was a very convincing and attractive collective identifier to which residents of the region and migrants in the diaspora could attach, if Ottomanism was growing less and less fashionable: Arab. The unifying ideology of the oneness of the Arab people was born in the Nahda, the so-called Arab literary and cultural renaissance or enlightenment of the late 19th century. Briefly, the idea of the unity of the Arabs and the consequent mobilization around this unity spread rapidly across the Ottoman Greater Syria and Egypt. Arabic newspapers, literary clubs and associations, and political parties sprang up across the region, calling for secular unity above all. Identifying as Arab, alongside Syrian and Ottoman, you could be all of the above, was so widespread and so effective as a unifier of the religiously, geographically, and ethnically diverse region, the most successful nationalist movement to emerge in the years of the war and after was in fact Arab nationalism. Beyond its power as a unifier, it seemed to stand the greatest chance of surviving the war because Britain expressed its support for an independent Arab kingdom encompassing all of Greater Syria in 1915. In fact, this is why the Arabs agreed to revolt against the Ottomans in 1916, 2 years into the war. In 1915, British High Commissioner for Egypt, Henry McMahon, pictured here, promised the Sharif of Mecca, Hussein bin Ali, independence as a united Arab nation in exchange for Arab support in fighting the Ottomans. But Britain had alternative plans. It was simultaneously meeting with its French, Italian, Russian, and Zionist counterparts in Europe to plan the partition of Anatolia, or modern-day Turkey, and Greater Syria. The two most important agreements for Greater Syria specifically are the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 and the Balfour Declaration of 1917. While the Sykes-Picot Agreement, signed between France and Britain in secret, divided Syria and Iraq into spheres of influence, later known as mandates, between France and England, the Balfour Declaration, named after the British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour, promised a portion of one of these mandates, Palestine, to the Zionist Federation of Great Britain and Ireland. How could Britain honor its conflicting promises? After all, it promised a portion of one of these mandates to the Zionists, while also promising the same piece of land within the larger region to the Sharif Hussein. of Mecca? The answer is simple. Britain was never concerned with keeping the promise it made to the Arabs. So by the time British forces occupied Palestine on December 11th, 1917, they had already made several plans. They already had several plans in the work that would seal its fate as a Jewish state 30 years later. But as any good historian will tell you, we have to think contingently. As we examine Britain's 30-year occupation of Palestine as a purported temporary mandate put in place to ensure the smooth transition of the native population to self-determination, we have to think as though 1948 did not happen. If we are to properly understand the Palestinian nationalist movement in the interwar years, we cannot assume that Palestinian nationalism failed and that Zionism won. As we try to understand how Palestinian political leaders and the Palestinian people behaved between 1917 and 1948, we have to imagine the possibilities they themselves believed were possible. We have to imagine, like they did, that Palestinian self-determination was within reach, certainly because it was promised to them, or Arab self-determination, let's say. For residents of Greater Syria, the ouster of the Ottomans from their lands in late 1917 and throughout 1918 was a cause for celebration. After all, they helped the Allied forces defeat them in the two-year Great Arab Revolt, and in return, they would be granted an independent kingdom that would include all of Greater Syria, including the southern portion known as Palestine. But Balfour's declaration was alarming. In the immediate aftermath of the war, nationalists across Greater Syria came together to agree on their political aspirations and to present them to the Allied forces, with the Balfour Declaration featuring prominently in their list of grievances and demands. In Palestine, nationalists gathered in Jerusalem between January and February 1919 to do so in the First Palestine Arab Congress. Between 1919 and 1928, 7 of these Palestine Arab Congresses met throughout Palestine. The Congresses were attended by members of the different Muslim Christian associations that had been set up a year prior in 1918 across Palestinian cities, mostly in Jaffa, Haifa, and Jerusalem, to strategize against the Zionist plan and increasing Jewish immigration to Palestine. So the first Congress that met in January and February had the following to say regarding Palestine's future. These were what they wanted for Palestine within Greater Syria. We consider Palestine nothing but part of Arab Syria, and it has never been separated from it at any stage. We are tied to it by national, religious, linguistic, moral, economic, and geographic bounds. Our district, Southern Syria or Palestine, should not be separated from the independent Arab Syrian government and be free from all foreign influence and protection. Following the first Congress, British forces banned Arab political associations and gatherings in Palestine. So representatives from this Congress attended the Syrian National Congress, which convened in Damascus in early June 1919, to, quote, inform Arab patriots there of the decision to call Palestine Southern Syria and unite it with Northern Syria. So the Congress that was held in Damascus served as the second Palestine Arab Congress since the Palestinians were banned from congregating earlier that year. And its delegates in Damascus protested the agreement reached in San Remo, Italy, 2 months prior on April 20th, between Britain, Italy, and France to create the mandates across Greater Syria and Iraq. In the end, the Damascus Congress drafted a list of demands of the Allied forces who were meeting at the so-called Paris Peace Conference that month in June, and weeks away from signing the Versailles Treaty that would officially end the war and seal their fates. Regarding Palestine, members of the Congress echoed the positions and demands of their Palestinian compatriots. Quote, we oppose the pretensions of the Zionists to create a Jewish commonwealth in the southern part of Syria, known as Palestine, and oppose Zionist migration to any part of our country. Note, they did not say Jewish migration. Secondly, we ask that there should be no separation of the southern part of Syria, known as Palestine, nor of the littoral western zone, which includes Lebanon, from the Syrian country. We desire that the unity of the country should be guaranteed against partition under whatever circumstances. These delegates of the Syrian National Congress were not invited to Versailles, nor were they consulted in any of the discussions regarding the political future of Greater Syria. But before they knew that their fates were sealed at Versailles later in the summer, Palestinian nationalists in Jerusalem tried their luck presenting their demands to a US delegation that was visiting the region in the summer of 1919. US President Woodrow Wilson sent the King Crane Commission to assess, quote, the state of opinion there in order to guide the Paris Peace Conference that was meeting then in assigning the mandates. Should Palestine go to the British? Do the people want the British? Should Lebanon go to the French? Do the Lebanese want the French? Of course, we see the demands of the actual residents of the region, and for the most part, the majority did not want any form of partition. The nationalists who met in Jerusalem to meet the King Crane Commission repeated the same demands when they met the commission in Palestine. Palestine should receive its independence within a united Arab kingdom called the Arab Kingdom of Syria. No Jewish national home should be established in Palestine. In its findings, compiled into a report in August 1919, the Commission urged a serious modification in the Zionist immigration program to Palestine, which was increasing dramatically. Between 1919 and 1923 alone, 40,000 Jews had immigrated from Europe and settled in Palestine, an unsustainable rate of immigration for an already inhabited land with such scarce resources and cultivable land. But Britain, the Zionists, and France had other plans, and the League of Nations in Geneva largely turned a blind eye. Indeed, though the Arabs proclaimed their independent kingdom in March 1920, with Damascus as its capital, and even drew up its borders and flag, Britain and France went ahead with their plans to sever the region with no objection from Geneva. France then dissolved the kingdom in July 1920 at the Battle of Maysalun, ousting the son of Sharif Hussein of Mecca. His name was Faisal, who was seen as the king of the Arabs. He would have been the king of the United Kingdom, and ousted him to Baghdad in Iraq, again with no objections from Geneva. In fact, Geneva approved the British and French mandates shortly thereafter in 1920. As for the southern region of the kingdom, Palestine, in December 1920, Britain unilaterally and illegally changed its status from wartime belligerent occupant, a status it assumed when it militarily occupied Palestine in December 1917. It changed its status to administrator by drafting the text of the mandate, effectively granting itself sovereignty over Palestine, even though the League of Nations hadn't approved the mandate yet. No matter what the Arabs did, no number of petitions, commissions, maps, flags, or congresses, nothing could stand in the way of these determined Europeans. The dream of a united Arab kingdom of Syria was thus put to rest. This is the Sharif Hussein seated on the left in white, and his two sons in the center, and he's on the left, and on his two sons, Abdullah I and Faisal in the center and on the right. And what happened to them I have summarized on the slide. But the population of Palestine, by the time Britain conducted its first census in 1922, didn't favor the British and Zionist plan. Of a total population of around 760,000, more than 650,000 were Arab Muslims and Christians, with a little over 80,000 Jews. So this demographic reality couldn't be overlooked, especially when it came to popular politics, which Palestinian nationalist leaders and British colonial authorities quickly became aware of. So let's introduce the cast of Palestinian nationalists, all of whom came from Jerusalem's notable Muslim families, especially the Husseinis, Nasashibis, Khalidis, Jarallas, Dajjanis, and a few others. But for the purposes of this lecture, let's focus on the Husseini and Nashashibi families or clans who produced three leaders who came to dominate the Palestinian nationalist movement in the 3 decades that ensued. We must keep in mind that despite rivalries between despite rivalries between the three and differences in their forms of leadership, they were all of the city's elite. They all collaborated with British forces to different extents, even against one another, and they all condemned the Zionist agenda. In this way, they operated on a very different level from the general population of Palestinians who were largely farmers or fallahin, and who by the mid-1930s had no choice but to take matters into their own hands to protect their lands, which were being appropriated by British forces and sold to Jewish settlers at a staggering rate. In other words, in the 1920s and early 30s, Palestinian nationalism developed in 2 separate streams, in large part because of the elite nationalists' reluctance to turn on British authorities. Musa Kadhim al-Husseini, described as, quote, the undisputed leader of the Palestinian Arabs, was the oldest and most respected of the nationalists. By the time he became mayor of Jerusalem in 1918, at the age of 65, he'd served in several prestigious governmental posts under the Ottomans, including as mutasarrif, remember the mutasarrifate of Jerusalem, or the equivalent of governor, between 1896 and 1913. And while he was preparing for retirement following his service as mutasarrif, the dramatic events of the war and the ouster of the Ottomans from Jerusalem in 1917 forced him out of retirement. His brother Hussein, who had restored their family's hold over the coveted position of mayor of Jerusalem, died in January 1918, 1 month after the British took the city. Britain subsequently dissolved the city's municipal council and appointed one consisting of 2 Muslims, 2 Christians, and 2 Jews. To appease the Arabs, they also appointed Musa Kadhim as mayor of Jerusalem. As mayor, Musa Kadhim immediately joined activists in the Muslim Christian associations to represent Palestinian demands to European and US forces. He also organized anti-Zionist protests in Jerusalem and Jaffa in the first months of 1920, resulting in Britain banning demonstrations in March. But weeks later, in preparation for the annual Muslim Nabi Musa festival, which coincided that year with Christian and Jewish holidays, Palestinians gathered in the Old City on April 4th, to hear speeches by the city's leading nationalists, including Musa Kadhim, Haj Amin al-Husseini, and Arif al-Arif. The trio spoke impassionedly about the unity of Greater Syria, with Palestine as its southern province. They proclaimed Faisal as king of the Arabs, and they confirmed their opposition to Zionism and Jewish immigration. The Arab crowd was riled up, and the ensuing riots that broke out between Arabs and Jews in the city, known as the Nabi Musa riots, lasted for 4 days, rocking Jerusalem. British forces accused Musa Kadhim of orchestrating the riots, even though he insisted that it was actually the Jews who instigated it and not the Palestinians. In fact, to this day, historians disagree on who instigated them, and there's evidence for both. But immediately following the riots, British military governor of Jerusalem, Ronald Storrs, dismissed Musa Kadhim from his mayorship, replacing him with one of his political rivals, Raghib al-Nashashibi. This move angered Palestinians who saw British forces deposing their esteemed mayor and meddling in their social affairs, pitting families against one another. Raghib al-Nashashibi, a successful engineer and member of one of Jerusalem's wealthiest families, had studied and worked in Istanbul during the last decades of Ottoman rule. In 1918, he was even elected deputy of mayor. He was elected deputy of Jerusalem in the Ottoman parliament, a position he held until the dismemberment of the empire in 1918, and one that launched his career in politics. Toward the end of World War I, Nashashibi came back to Jerusalem and was appointed head of the Public Works Department for the Jerusalem district. In 1919, he joined the nationalists in drafting demands of the King Crane Commission. Despite the failure of their initiative with the commission, Nashashibi continued to climb the political ladder thanks to his ability to win over British authorities with his compliance. So when Ronald Storrs, the British military government, decided to replace Musa Kadhim with Nashashibi in April 1920 after the riots, he described Musa Kadhim as, quote, intractable and then defiant. And he described Nashashibi as, quote, unquestionably the ablest Arab in Palestine. He also described him in his memoirs as quite obedient. Importantly, Musa Kadhim and Nashashibi were both secular in their leadership and relatively out of touch with popular politics, making them easier targets for coercion and manipulation by British forces. But another Husseini, young, devout, and modest, despite his family's wealth, was much harder to control thanks to his public appeal. Amin Husseini was not only young and the son of the Mufti, or the Muslim religious leader of Jerusalem, he had also studied Islamic law, theology, philosophy, and Arabic in the prestigious Al-Azhar University in Cairo. In 1913, at the age of 18, he even went on Hajj to Mecca, the ultimate sign of piety in Islam. This later earned him the title of Haj Amin, which is how he's referred to this day. Following his pilgrimage to Mecca, he returned to Jerusalem to teach and write, including about the Zionist threat to Jerusalem, or to Palestine, And following a year of teaching, he enrolled in the military academy in Istanbul and was subsequently drafted to the Ottoman army during the war. Though young Amin joined the Ottoman army to defend Muslim lands from the Christian European invaders, His ultimate mission, which he was known to declare and to write about, was to defend Palestine from the Zionist threat. So in 1916, the surest way of doing so was to join the Arab revolt alongside British forces against the Ottomans, because Britain had promised the Arabs independence in exchange for their help in ousting the Ottomans, and this would include Palestine. So Amin took a sick leave from the Ottoman war front and returned to Jerusalem, and in February 1917, he enlisted in the Arab army alongside British forces to fight the Ottomans. But at the end of the war, 1918, Haj Amin returned to Jerusalem and began organizing politically. He was elected president of the newly formed literary and political group Nadi al-Arabi, or the Arab Club, which worked alongside the Muslim Christian Association and Al-Muntada al-Arabi, or the Literary Forum, Al-Adabi, excuse me, the Literary Forum, to inculcate Palestinian nationalism in Jerusalem and across Palestine under the banner of Pan-Arabism. For Haj Amin, Palestine was inseparable from Greater Syria, an integral position in his struggle against Zionism. To spread his message, he, quote, campaigned among the urban class as well as among the fallahin, something few Arab aristocrats did, end quote. But Haj Amin established himself as a pragmatic leader. Rather than oppose British rule, he was determined to influence British policy from within. In addition to briefly returning to Jerusalem to teach, he joined the British military administration as a clerk and spent time in Damascus in this position, where he focused on learning more about Pan-Arabism. He returned to Jerusalem in 1919 and joined other nationalists in preparing Palestinian demands of the King Crane Commission. He also helped organize protests in Jerusalem, Jaffa, and Haifa against Zionism and the Balfour Declaration. He then joined Musa Kadhim in delivering those impassioned speeches to the crowd of Arabs who gathered in the Old City on the first day of the Nabi Musa festival on April 4th, 1920. These riots that rocked Jerusalem, as a result of them, British forces imposed a strict crackdown on Palestinians. So Haj Amin and the third speaker, Arif al-Arif, fled Jerusalem, first to the city of Karak in today Jordan, then to Damascus. British authorities then sentenced both of them to 10 years in absentia. But in July 1920, the first High Commissioner for Palestine, Herbert Samuel, pardoned Haj Amin and Arif and allowed them back to Palestine, likely because he recognized the influence the two had in Jerusalem and the rest of Palestine among the Arab population. It was in his interest to appease the Arabs of Palestine following the dramatic events of April. But the appointment of Samuel, who was a Zionist, as High Commissioner was met with protest by Palestinian nationalists. In June 1920, 1 week before Samuel's arrival in Jerusalem, members of the Muslim Christian Association sent a letter to the British military commander explaining that their choice of Samuel opposed the wishes of the Arabs. They said, quote, inhabitants of Palestine cannot recognize him, and Muslim Christian associations cannot accept responsibility for riots or other disturbances of peace. Nonetheless, Britain went ahead with appointing Samuel, and though violence did not break out, representatives of Muslim Christian associations across Palestine met at the Third Palestine Congress in Haifa in December 1920 to organize a Palestinian position against the troubling events of that year. The Congress resolved to form an executive committee of 9 members, electing Musa Kadhim as president and chairman. You can see him seated right there. The committee, known as the Arab Executive Committee, operated for 14 years, and though Britain never actually recognized it. Between 1920 and 1934, so 14 years, Musa Kadhim remained the the Arab Executive's chairman, and maintained opposition to British policy on Zionism and Jewish immigration. He and other members of the committee worked toward fulfilling these demands, which were also those of the Muslim Christian associations: Palestinian independence as part of an Arab state, and the formation of a national assembly in Palestine that would include proportional Jewish representation, something that the Jewish community at this time regularly rejected due to their minority demographic status. Then the Fourth Palestine Congress met in Jerusalem in May 1921, and they tasked Musa Kadhim with leading a delegation of representatives from the Arab Executive Committee to London that summer to make these demands clear. The delegation failed to secure any wins in London. Meanwhile, Haj Amin, who was in absentia, refused to return under Samuel's pardon, saying he hadn't done anything wrong to be pardoned. But his brother Kamil, who was Mufti of Jerusalem at the time, or Muslim religious leader, fell ill. Amin was determined to assume the coveted position following his brother, and so he returned to Jerusalem. Since severing Jerusalem from Istanbul in all religious matters in 1918, at the end of the war, British forces assigned the Mufti in Jerusalem responsibility for the Islamic Sharia courts in the city, as well as the Waqf lands, or lands granted through charity and held in trust. These are, let's say, Muslim lands, right? British authorities thus awarded the Mufti greater powers, changing the title to Grand Mufti, or Mufti al-Akbar, and effectively making whoever assumed the position, quote, the virtual religious leader of the Muslim community in Palestine. Kamil died shortly thereafter in March 1921, and Amin had already been vying for the powerful position. And given his, Haj Amin, and given his family's power in the city, his military and political accomplishments during the war, his devoutness, as well as his experience in exile in Jordan and Syria, he was the people's choice. But several of Jerusalem's families also entered members in the election campaign for Grand Mufti, and they opposed Haj Amin's appointment. Ultimately, it was the High Commissioner who would select the Mufti based on candidates put forth by a committee of Muslim Arabs. And in 1921, the committee put forth 3 candidates with no Husseini representation. This angered the Husseinis, who claimed the results were invalid. And they weren't alone in their anger. Apparently, Palestinians across the country submitted petitions to the British government of Palestine in Jerusalem with, quote, hundreds of signatures of protest against the election, including from Palestinian Christians. The people wanted Haj Amin. When military governor Storrs sent High Commissioner Samuel the many Palestinian petitions indicating that Haj Amin was the popular choice, Samuel met with Haj Amin. According to Norman Bentwick, Attorney General of the British Mandate, Haj Amin conveyed, quote, his earnest desire to cooperate with the government and his belief in the good intention of the government towards the Arabs. He gave assurance that the influence of his family and himself would be devoted to maintaining tranquility in Jerusalem, end quote. In mid-May 1921, Samuel managed to qualify Haj Amin as one of the 3 candidates after convincing Nashashibi through Storrs to persuade another candidate to drop out of the race. So Samuel subsequently selected Haj Amin as Mufti of Jerusalem. British forces also appointed him president of the Supreme Muslim Council, which they established that year in December to oversee Muslim courts and schools and to manage the Islamic Waqf. And with the rising influence of the Husseini family, now holding both the muftiship and the presidency of the Supreme Muslim Council, the British mandate allowed the Nashashibis to form an opposition bloc, or the Mu'arada, to the main factions, known as the Majlisiyin, dominated by Haj Amin and his family. The scandals surrounding the Nabi Musa riots, the mayoral campaign for Jerusalem, the elections of Mufti, and the subsequent bipartisan politics indicate the extent to which British forces strategically pitted Palestinian families against one another, and connectedly, the extent to which these families sought British favor. While the new Mufti of Jerusalem, or Haj Amin, may have been the people's choice relative to the other leaders, he was still ultimately subservient to British interests. Throughout the 1920s, Palestinian nationalists thus believed that their aspirations could be fulfilled through British channels, and they were not prepared to abandon this approach. After all, turning on the British would cost them and their families their coveted positions. So I'll fast forward through the next few years, which were largely characterized by the same frustrating results for Palestinian nationalists, increasing tensions and violence among Palestinians and Jews across Palestine, and a growing rift between Palestinians and their leaders. Despite several Palestine Arab congresses and delegations to London, led by Musa Kadhim, Jewish immigration to Palestine was increasing. More and more Palestinian land was being confiscated, and divisions still plagued the Palestinian movement, while the Zionists grew more and more powerful. But even when Palestinian nationalists put aside their differences for the good of the movement, their efforts were equally quashed. At the 7th and last Palestine Arab Congress, held in Jerusalem in June 1928, members decided to form a united front between the Majlisiyin and the Mu'aradin, or sort of the main party and the opposition bloc, with Musa Kadhim as their leader. Between 1928 and 1930, Palestinian nationalist movement was as organized and united as ever. And in September 1929, following the violent events of the Buraq uprising that broke out in Jerusalem in late August between Arabs and Jews, nationalists held an emergency meeting and decided to send a delegation to London, headed by Musa Kadhim. A month later, the Arab Women's Association of Palestine held the first Arab Women's Congress in Jerusalem. With 200 Palestinian Muslim and Christian women in attendance, the Congress was the first of its kind in the Arab and Muslim world. Its members passed 3 resolutions: the abrogation of the Balfour Declaration, a proportionally representative national government, and the development of Palestinian industry. A delegation from the Congress even visited the High Commissioner in Jerusalem to make these demands of him directly, as well to no avail. In late March 1930, Musa Kadhim and Nashashibi led a singular delegation to London to present their most moderate requests of their colonizers yet. They were joined by Haj Amin and 3 other nationalists. In addition to calling for restricting Jewish immigration and land sales to Jews, the United Palestinian Delegation requested the formation of a, quote, democratically elected legislature, proportionally representing Arabs and Jews, under a British High Commissioner who could veto legislation that he considered inconsistent with the mandatory obligation. But even this approach was useless. The delegation's requests were denied, after which Musa Kadhim sent a telegram to the Arab executive in Jerusalem saying the following: "The Arab cause in Palestine will not find a just solution at the hands of the British government, which is under Zionist influence." Musa Kadhim returned to Jerusalem from London, convinced that Britain would never fulfill Palestinian demands, so he took matters into his own hands. In 1932, he formed and headed the National Fund in Jerusalem as a way to raise funds to buy lands in Palestine to counter what the Jewish National Fund was doing at the time, which was buying up land and giving it to Jewish immigrants. So what he was doing through the National Fund was raising funds to purchase the land through a Palestinian channel. By 1929, 82,000 Jews had settled in Palestine, a dramatic increase since the last wave of immigrants, which saw 40,000 arriving to the country. In response, Musa Kadhim and his compatriots mobilized Palestinians in new protests in late 1933, despite a British ban on demonstrations issued on October 10th. On October 27th, just a couple of weeks later, the first demonstration in Jaffa began, and British police met it with live fire, leading to 11 deaths and 20 injuries, including 80-year-old Musa Kadhim, who was beaten to the ground by baton-wielding Mandate police. But the protest didn't end that day and instead spread to Haifa, Nablus, and Jerusalem, leading to dozens of casualties. The Arab executive declared a 3-day strike, and demonstrations spread as far as Damascus, leading the High Commissioner to reinstate martial law, which had been first instated in 1931. The decree reinstating martial law, quote, legalized wide censorship, arrests without warrant, and detention without charge or representation, deportation without appeal, and secret military courts. Even a New York Times correspondent in Jerusalem noted in October 1933 that the High Commissioner was given, quote, dictatorial powers. Musa Kadhim didn't recover from his injuries that he sustained in Jaffa. He spent the next 5 months at home and died in March 1934 at the age of 81. The passing of the revered leader brought with it the end of an era in Palestinian nationalist politics. Britain dissolved the Arab executive that year, and with it, even though it had never recognized it, and with it, the hope of a unified Palestinian front against British and Zionist policies. The cleavages between the city's families, the leading families, deepened after his death, ushering in a new and more revolutionary form of Palestinian popular resistance that would lead 2 years later to the Great Palestinian Revolt. As for Nashashibi, in 1934, he lost the mayoralty to Hussein al-Khalidi, another member of Jerusalem's elite, after 14 years in the position. Defeated and discredited as leader of the opposition, Nashashibi formed another party, the National Defense Party, as the main opposition party. While the NDP was adamantly against British immigration and the Balfour Declaration, its elite members and its compliance with the British was no match for the increasingly anti-British leadership of Khalidi and the Majlisiyin, even though they too were quite elite. Meanwhile, Haj Amin was appealing to the Arab and Muslim worlds to protect Palestine from the Zionist threat, mainly through financial donations. In December 1931, he hosted the General Islamic Congress in Jerusalem, attended by representatives of several Muslim and Arab countries. The Congress resolved to condemn Jewish immigration, land sales to Jews, and Zionist designs on Muslim holy places. It also called for the boycott of Zionist goods, as well as the establishment of a Muslim university in Jerusalem. It affirmed solidarity with the Christian Arab Palestinians. Despite this united regional effort, the Zionists had simply grown far too powerful by then, in large part due to British support. In between 1933 and 1936, 130,000 Jews had settled in Palestine, ushering in unprecedented expropriation of land in Palestine. The Palestinian people themselves, the Fallahin, thus began abandoning their leaders' moderate, diplomatic, and compliant approaches, turning instead to the more revolutionary methods of the Qassamites and the Istiqlalists and a few other revolutionary groups. In addition to having no ties to the British, like Haj Amin and the Supreme Muslim Council and the Arab Executive, leaders of the Istiqlal and Qassam groups opposed moderation, and they opposed rivalries amongst the Husseinis and the Nashashibis. Therefore, they found increasing support among the Palestinian public. This threatened Haj Amin, of course, who went on the offensive. Still in control of the Sharia courts and the Waqf, and still seen as the Mufti, or the leader of the Muslims of Palestine, he wielded considerable influence and ran a campaign against the Istiqlalists. By late 1930, he managed to neutralize them, but not the Qassamites, who were led by the hugely popular and revolutionary Sheikh Izzuddin al-Qassam. Al-Qassam from Syria had been active since the 1920s, preaching revolution against European forces alike. By 1933, Al-Qassam had formed a loyal following, Qassamites, who remained clandestine in their armed operations, and Qassam even asked Haj Amin to co-lead a revolution across Palestine, but Haj Amin refused. Qassam thus decided to wage the armed uprising against the British himself. But before he could announce a revolt, he and his troops were ambushed by British forces, a fight which led to his death in November 1935 in Nazlet Zaid, a village in what is today the northern West Bank. This sent a shockwave through Palestine, and revolutionary groups formed across the country, largely among the Fallahin, or the farmers, to carry out Al-Qassam's mission of resisting Zionism and British rule themselves. This marked the first Palestinian Intifada, or uprising, and following several months of Arab confrontations with British forces and Zionist paramilitary groups, the British government declared a state of emergency in April 1936. Until April, Haj Amin had maintained his diplomatic approach of finding a political solution, but the increased violence and Palestinian revolutionary groups' announcement of a general strike on April 19 in Nablus, Jaffa, and Haifa put him in another thorny position, since the Palestinian people expected him to lead the revolution now that Qasim had been assassinated. On April 25th, Haj Amin accepted to lead the revolution on the condition that the movement be a united one. The revolutionary groups agreed and convinced Nashashibi to join the newly formed Arab Higher Committee, headed by Haj Amin. While this committee was the most representative of the different constituents of the Palestinian nationalist movement, and by that time, it was born as a result of the general strike that was spreading across the country, which meant that it was subordinate to a revolutionary and unpredictable tide largely led by the public. The committee had to reflect the demands of the people and therefore called for the general strike to continue until British forces ceded to Palestinian demands and seized Jewish immigration. On April 26, 1936, Haj Amin sent the manifesto of the new committee to the High Commissioner, along with a letter outlining the Palestinian demands. Toward the end of the letter, he said, quote, "The Arabs are of the strong belief that the continuation of the present policy will lead them to immediate annihilation. They find themselves compelled moved by their struggle for existence to defend their country and national rights. He conveyed his trust that the High Commissioner would, quote, endeavor to effect a fundamental change in English policy. Haj Amin therefore threw his weight behind the popular strike, which marked a turning point in the leader's approach to British Mandate forces, one from which he would never return. On May 4th, just a month later, Haj Amin informed the High Commissioner that the Arab Committee would support the strikers' call to stop paying taxes. The High Commissioner warned Amin and the committee against associating themselves with the move. But even Nashashibi supported the proposal to not pay taxes, and it passed. Later that month, British forces arrested 61 Palestinian leaders, including prominent figures from the Nashashibi family. As a result, Nashashibi and others spread rumors that Haj Amin, who avoided arrest, knew of the arrest beforehand and that he promised the High Commissioner to end the strike. This created backlash against Haj Amin from both the public and members of the committee, the majority of whom voted for a proposal of no confidence against him. Things were not looking good for the nationalists yet again. With the ongoing strike, the refusal to pay taxes, and the committee's recalcitrance against the British forces unleashed brute force, dispersing crowds, arresting thousands, imprisoning and executing revolutionaries, and leveling entire Palestinian villages. Haj Amin evidently wrote that following these events, he was shocked by the, quote, cruelty of the English, which by October 1936 had left 1,000 Palestinians killed. 6 months into the revolt, British authorities sent a new commission to Palestine, the Peel Commission, to investigate the causes of the uprising, and it published its report in July 1937. But during the first half of 1937, the economic and political situation in Palestine grew dire, with unemployment skyrocketing and British forces growing increasingly oppressive. Rumor had it that the Peel Commission would be recommending partition in Palestine. Haj Amin, who was a champion of pan-Arabism, opposed partition and therefore grew more supportive of reigniting the rebellion. Meanwhile, Nashashibi resigned from the Arab Higher Committee days before the commission published its report, which raised a lot of eyebrows. Palestinians across the country rejected the partition plan, and in Jerusalem, British authorities had it. The High Commissioner couldn't find any reasonable reason to deport Haj Amin, but he was eager to be rid of him. He thus used a letter that Haj Amin had sent to Arab leaders, urging them to, quote, work for rescuing the country from imperialism and Jewish colonization and partition as justification for deporting him. On July 17, the High Commissioner sent the police to arrest him, but he'd already escaped through a back door to the Haram al-Sharif, or the Temple Mount, in Jerusalem's Old City. Obviously, Haj Amin knew that the British forces wouldn't dare to enter the sacred space, which would ignite further riots. Haj Amin remained in the sanctuary throughout the summer of 1937 and resumed his calls for pan-Arab resistance to partition. But this untenable situation didn't last for long. 2 months later, on September 26, Palestinians assassinated a British district commissioner of the Galilee in northern Palestine. And even though Haj Amin and the Arab Committee condemned the assassination, British authorities dealt a crushing blow to Palestinian leadership, including Haj Amin. They dissolved the Arab High Committee and other political groups, arrested 200 Palestinian political leaders, including deporting some of them to the Seychelles, where many of them died, and stripped Haj Amin of his chairmanship of the Waqf Committee. But before they could come for him, Haj Amin escaped from the Haram al-Sharif during the night of October 14, made it somehow to Jaffa, and fled to Lebanon by boat, where he continued his efforts to lead the rebellion in absentia. He never returned to Palestine. Meanwhile, Nashashibi had managed to avoid the fate of other Palestinian nationalists targeted by the British, but this came at a cost. Many Palestinians, including members of his own party, the NDP, saw him as a collaborator with the British in pursuing the partition plan. He was a well-known good friend of Amir Abdullah I of Transjordan, who favored partition since it meant that part of Palestine would be added to Transjordan. Nashashibi's reputation thus tottered among Palestinians following the dissolution of the Arab Higher Committee. While he managed to avoid arrest and exile, unlike Haj Amin, who was in Beirut, he failed to restore unity among Palestinian factions when a new wave of protest erupted against the Peel Commission in the fall of 1937. Throughout the remainder of the Great Palestinian Revolt, which lasted another 2 years, the NDP's membership shrank substantially, and many of its members pulled out, even in exile. By the end of the Great Palestinian Revolt in August 1939, over 5,000 Palestinians had been killed. And then Germany invaded Poland, September 1939, spiraling Europe into a Second World War that lasted 6 years. During these years, with Palestinians having just emerged from a 3-year rebellion that decimated their leadership, their popular resistance, and the very landscape of rural Palestine, Palestine was relatively calm. That said, 250,000 Jews fled Europe and settled in Palestine. The remaining decade of British rule in Palestine saw further attempts by Nashashibi and other leaders of new groups like the Palestine Arab Party, the Independence Party, the National Bloc Party, the Reform Party, to reconstitute the Arab Higher Committee. But these short-lived efforts failed, in great part due to these long-standing rivalries and skepticism among many of the leaders, but mostly due to their exile or assassination by British forces, and the defeat of Palestinian popular morale following the Great Revolt. The most renowned nationalist leader, Haj Amin, by that point, spent years running from British and Zionist forces. From Lebanon, he went to Iraq, then to Iran, then to Turkey, Italy, Germany, France, Switzerland, Egypt, and finally back to Lebanon, where he died in 1974. His different attempts to lead to continue the Palestinian revolution from absentia over the course of his exile met with failure. So by the start of 1948, there was thus no viable Palestinian nationalist leadership, secular, pan-Arab, Islamic, elite, popular, armed revolutionary, or what have you. The Palestinian people themselves, defeated, leaderless, and terrorized by Zionist paramilitary forces throughout the early months of 1948, terror campaigns to which the British turned a blind eye, were largely unable to fend for themselves. Thousands fled in the lead up to the Nakba, or the catastrophe of May 1948, from across Palestine, including my own grandparents and great-grandparents who sought refuge in neighboring countries. And in May 1948, 76 years next month, 700,000 more Palestinians were expelled from their homes, amounting to 80% of the Palestinian population at the time. Their descendants, myself included, remain in exile to this day. So, investigating when and why we started identifying as Palestinians or Palestinian Arabs has no bearing on the realities that have defined our lives as a collective for over a century. These realities being colonization, settler colonization, ethnic cleansing, expulsion, refugeehood, military occupation, apartheid, siege, blockade, and today, genocide. However you name us, the non-Jewish inhabitants of the lands between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, and who today amount to 7 million on that land and millions more throughout an expansive exile, have been living a unique reality for over a century. Let's call that reality Palestinian. What I hope has become clear from this overview of Palestinian political history during the first half of the 20th century is the extent to which the British mandate, set a precedent for the subsequent intolerance for and annihilation of Palestinian self-determination since 1948. That Palestinian nationalist leaders, no matter how compliant, were never allowed more than nominal representation and administration over their population and over Muslim shrines and properties, started over a century ago and persists to this day under Israeli rule. In fact, the US vetoed the latest attempt by Palestinian leadership at achieving even nominal statehood at the UN just last week. But the mandate period made something else quite clear. These Palestinian leaders, like any elite leadership born of the colonial experience, have been complicit in perpetuating the very colonial mechanisms and orders that ensure the ongoing suppression of indigenous self-determination, while somehow also claiming to defend it, right? What this means for Palestinians 100 years ago and today is that whatever gains we've made in confronting and dismantling settler colonialism, occupation, and apartheid have largely been achieved in spite of our so-called representative leadership. In fact, our intifadas or uprisings have been entirely popular in the absence of our leaders. Likewise, our solidarity movement, which is arguably the largest global popular movement in modern history, has formed and continues to operate in spite of state leadership. In this way, the mandate period set yet another precedent. Whenever Palestinian resistance actually turns against the colonial or settler colonial order, it's either suppressed, exiled, assassinated, vilified as terrorist, or most recently, anti-Semitic. That Israel has inherited and exacerbated British oppressive colonial policies isn't a new argument, but it begs the question of the legacy set by the mandate when it comes to the governance of Palestine by its occupiers. Namely, that it's okay to continue to treat Palestine and the Palestinians as exceptions to international law. This is to say that the practice of denying Palestinians basic rights to return, to self-determination, or even to life, with such impunity, has its roots in the world order that codified these very rights after World War I. The genocide in Gaza today makes this Palestine exception in international law abundantly clear, as we know. But while we Palestinians have never had international law on our side, nor our own nation state for that matter, we've never doubted that we are Palestinian, culturally, linguistically, geographically, politically, wherever we are. Ironically, Jews in exile could identify with this very well before 1948. And today, our very existence as Palestinians and the very word Palestine have become so synonymous with freedom, justice, resistance. Millions across the world look to us for inspiration and guidance. As a stateless people, I don't think we can ask to be more political than this. What this means about how we should conceive of collective Palestinian political consciousness in the past or today, whether in exile or under various forms of oppression across historic Palestine, requires us to think outside the box, beyond nation states and their militaries. In fact, many Palestinians today will tell you that we don't want a state. States are the problem, and that we continue to exist in spite of states. It strikes me as particularly critical to fully attend to the myriad and historical reasons why that is, to perhaps even learn from this Palestinian experience, because who we are and what we represent as people and as a cause can't be erased or overlooked. Not in 1936, not in 1948, and not in Palestine today. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadim. Wow, that covered a lot of ground. Well, you see the hearts and the claps coming up in our webinar mode. So thank you all. If there are any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. And I apologize if there was one person who asked a question saying, will this video be available afterwards? And yes, indeed, this, as all of our videos, will be available on the Buffett Institute website and also their YouTube channel. Okay, so we have, it looks like 4 questions who might be from the same person named anonymous attendee. I'll start with one of those and then we can move around. So the first question says, and a bit of a provocation, I think, as well. It seems like it was less about having a Palestinian state and more about not wanting any Zionist state. Did Palestinians ever consider agreeing to a Zionist state in order to also get a Palestinian state?
That is an interesting question, and I think it depends at which point the question is focused on. But a Palestinian state, as separate from a united Arab state that included all of Greater Syria, today the entire sort of Eastern Mediterranean region, this was always part of the Palestinian nationalist movement, which was seen as a pan-Arab movement by its leaders. So calling for an independent Palestinian state throughout the 20s and 30s was actually counterproductive to the larger goal of a united Arab kingdom. It wasn't until later, once the UN proposed partition to an Arab state and a Jewish state, that some of the Palestinian nationalists, some of the leaders at that point, but again, by then they had been scattered and assassinated and depleted almost entirely, were considering it, right? So until the fragmentation of Greater Syria which was started happening in the mid-40s, right? When Syria got its independence, Lebanon, Jordan, Transjordan, from Britain and France, that's when it became sort of a fait accompli that there would not be a united Arab state. So up until then, the idea of dividing southern Syria or Palestine from the rest of the region, whether to form a Zionist state or a Palestinian state, was not part of the goal. And it was always, until after World War II, a united Arab state.
Excellent. That I think leads a bit into to the next two questions I'm going to combine from the same anonymous attendee who asks, since these country lines are all formed by British, French, and after the Ottoman Empire, why can't there be a Palestinian state in what is now Syria and or Lebanon? And similarly asks, you said the Zionist threat, the Ottoman Empire was huge. Why was making a tiny sliver of land to a Zionist state as it was being broken up such a threat? So I kind of grouped those because there are two questions sort of related to this larger question of the map. Oops. If you could not, let me get back to that question that was just, sorry, they disappeared. They were dismissed. So I guess one question is, why couldn't there be a Palestinian state in Syria and Lebanon? And next, sort of why with the Zionist entity, I'm sorry, the questions are moving around, so I can no longer see them. Why? So maybe we'll start there. I saw them try to combine them, but why couldn't there be a Palestinian state in Syria and Lebanon? And why, given that the Ottoman Empire was so huge, why couldn't this little sliver be a Zionist state? Yeah.
I'm baffled by these questions, to be honest. You can't just call a people something else and a land something else to make it okay for other people to call that land what they want it for them. I mean, we were there, we lived there, it was Palestine, it was part of Syria. To tell us to just go off and form our own little collective in Syria and Lebanon is calling for ethnic cleansing, is calling for genocide, is calling for displacement, is saying that another group should have this state because they don't want to share it with anyone else. And that's okay. And so I'm sorry, I think that's all that question needs. Why not just give a sliver of a massive empire to the Jews or the Zionists? Sure. I mean, I guess that question could be posed, but again, it goes to who was there, what population was living there, at what cost would this state come? And clearly we see 100 years later, it's still coming at a cost, and that cost is still ethnic cleansing, it's still occupation, it's still apartheid, it's still genocide, right? I mean, Herbert Samuel, I'm sorry, Theodor Herzl was considering other locations, right, for establishing a state. Argentina was one of the biggest contenders. And they were weighing the pros and cons of what that meant for the Jewish community in sort of resolving the Jewish question of exile. Palestine was consistently the top choice because of its significance to the Jewish faith. Likewise, for Christians and Muslims who have always been on that land, it's the same sort of argument. How could you just re-establish a state for people who are already there, who already identify as from there, who have been on that land for generations, and tell them just go form your state somewhere else because another group is coming to lay claim to this land, and it's going to be a Jewish land and not inclusive of the other faiths that exist, right? So again, it's a question of at what cost would establishing this Zionist state come? And we're seeing the repercussions of that.
Thank you. I think you answered the questions, that question very well. The next question is from Jacqueline Zallinger. I get from the tone of this that she might be a friend of yours. Do you guys know each other? She says, "Hi, Nadim."
Oh yes, of course, Jackie.
Jackie, terrific. So to quote Jackie with a smiley face, first commending you for a wonderful presentation. She says, "I've been wondering lately about the Muslim Christian associations that were founded around 1918. I know that there was also a small population of non-Zionist, Ladino-speaking and Yiddish-speaking Jews in Palestine before the mandate. Do you have any ideas about why the associations formed were specifically called Muslim Christian associations? And specifically, do you have any sense of why Ladino-speaking Jews wouldn't have been involved in that particular political work?"
That's a really fascinating question, and I wish I knew why they chose Muslim Christian associations. Maybe Wendy, you might know, but from the evidence I have looked at in terms of what these committees were calling for and how they were presented in the Syrian National Congress, especially in 1919, 1 year after. I didn't read this, but this was one of their demands, was saying that we demand that Palestine not be severed from Syria. And this is supported by our Jewish compatriots, right? being the Palestinian Jews. So it was seen as a Zionist threat, of course, that was coming, not a Jewish threat. And so they were seen as separate. So I believe, based on what these committees were saying, is that these Muslim Christian associations, most likely because the families were the prominent families, happened to be Muslim and Christians. Again, these are family politics, right? And the families in Jerusalem and these bigger cities tended to be Palestinian Christians or Muslims, the wealthy, powerful families that organize these associations. That part of their demands would include the indigenous Jewish population as part of this collective fighting against the Zionist threat. But I think it really would have been a fascinating thing to just call them Muslim Christian Jewish associations of Palestine, right? I imagine that there is an answer to that question, and I'm now curious to look it up. So thanks, Jack.
Yeah, thank you. Me too. Fantastic. So next question is for one of our soon-to-be graduated PhD students, Nick Baskunyan-Wiley, who says, I would love to hear more about the role of the diaspora in the pre-48 navigations of colonial rule in Zionism. I would love to hear more about the diaspora. I think you know a thing about that.
Yeah.
So
Knowing Nick's work
yes.
and loving Nick's work, I imagine the question is about the Arab and Palestinian diaspora, maybe in Latin America, more specifically. So I recommend my book. So activism was very much part of this community's daily life when it came to sort of transnational activism and remaining connected to the homeland and caring about what was happening in the homeland. The most important way for these communities in the diaspora, we're talking, about 40,000 by 1940, Palestinians, specifically from southern Syria. The most sort of urgent way in which they believed they could help the cause and counter the increasing Zionist influence or Jewish immigration was to register as Palestinians and receive and apply for British Palestinian citizenship, which is the topic of the book, right? So in this period, thousands of Palestinians in the diaspora started applying for citizenship through the British mandate in Jerusalem to qualify for Palestinian citizenship under British rule. And Britain almost unanimously, Britain denied thousands of applications of these migrants for Palestinian citizenship, claiming that they had been gone for too long. They couldn't prove intention to return permanently. They couldn't prove that they were born there, even though none of this, of course, was true, because as the book shows, they actually had the evidence. They were born there. They had clearly vested interest in maintaining connections and going back and inheriting property and residing and so on. So the biggest way for the diaspora community to show its solidarity with the homeland and counter any threats to Palestine was by, in a way, securing a Palestinian presence and securing a Palestinian legal connection to the land from abroad. Right? It wasn't necessarily return and fight the good fight and join no, because the community's primary concern was to survive economically, and going back would not necessarily secure that because there's so much tumult in Palestine. But unfortunately, and as we know today, the largest Palestinian communities outside the Middle East are in Latin America, especially Chile. So these Palestinians have not been able to go back. They were denied citizenship, denied rights to return well before 48. There were also many committees formed, the committees to defend Palestine, the committees to defend Syria, right? And they were all seen as packaged as part of regional efforts. So it wasn't just against Zionism or the British in Palestine, it was against the French in Syria and Lebanon. It was against the British in Iraq. It was against the British in Egypt. It was, so it was just a massive campaign. And for Palestine specifically, it was through citizenship and trying to secure nationality.
Excellent, thank you. One, Marcelo Marzuka wrote, does Nadim have a published article or book covering these issues? Would love to read more. So Margaret just put into the chat a link to Nadim's page in Al-Shabaka, so you can find more of his work in addition to the book that's gone out. I don't know if Nadim, if you want to mention any other works of yours that are relevant, or maybe we'll wait for this presentation to make itself into published form.
I think the book and the article from Shabaka would be are a great starting point. There's also an article about the Palestinian community in Chile, in Nakla, Report on the Americas, about the activism that Nick was asking about in the 20s. And then there's an article in JPS about the citizenship law by the British that they use to deny Palestinians across Latin America their rights to nationality. That's called legislating exclusion. But all of these, are pieces of the book. They come before the book. So I just would recommend that you read the book. And the Shabaka piece came after the book. So it's about what is Palestinian nationality about today? What sort of rights protected by international law do Palestinians all over the world, including Latin America today, have when it comes to nationality?
Wonderful. So we have another question that's like another of a provocative question, but it resonates with two that are in the Q&A now. And this one says, I understand where you started your timeline, but you have not said where the name Palestine comes from. And starting at the Ottoman Empire is convenient for the story, but can you explain how Judea and other areas became Palestine? So however you want to go with that, either about the origins of the name Palestine or where we start the timeline for these types of questions, or perhaps a nod here to the ancient history of the area too, and how that fits in to the story.
I'm not in any way an expert on ancient history, biblical history. In fact, I've done my best to avoid it because it becomes so wrapped up in archaeological evidence and all sorts of non-archival sources when it comes to this non-recorded history, right? In document form, right? I will just say that at no point in the history that I've studied, starting, let's say, the Crusades before, Palestine has just always been the name, a geographic, historic name given to the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, and it includes Judea and Samaria. Like there's no problem with the term Palestine being, certainly there seems to be a question about why should it be called Palestine if it's Judea and Samaria, but only until the Zionism did that become an issue, is the point here, right? Only until Zionism saying that this land is not Palestine. Well, actually, no, they chose Palestine. Theodor Herzl called it Palestine, saying we want Palestine as the location of a Jewish nation, right, or a national home. So only until 1948, when the decision became to no longer call it, or to call it Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, did the sense that its origin as a land called Palestine, including all the faiths, all the biblical history, only at that point did it become politically inappropriate or politically antagonistic to call it something else. Similarly, for Palestinians, 1948 becomes the time when a land that had always been known as Palestine, to its multi-religious, multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic inhabitants, became no longer recognized or seen, became something else, right? So why did the discussion start in the late Ottoman period? Well, because I was asked to give a lecture about the foundations of Palestinian nationalism, right? Palestinian nationalism as a political identifier, as a political category, really did start then, right? And I hope it became clear that it wasn't its own thing. It was also rising or coming up alongside other nationalisms: Arab nationalism, Syrian nationalism, Lebanese nationalism. These things Jewish nationalism as well, right? It just so happened that Zionism and Palestinian nationalism wanted the same piece of land, right? So it is really in the 19th century that we see nationalisms become a thing across the world. And that's why it started there. And it was Ottoman at that point. So
no, thank you. And I really would put the pressure on you to answer that question. When this is a question to our entire speaker series that begins in the late Ottoman Empire and focuses from the late 19th century and the earliest 20th century. And so this is also something for all of us, the co-sponsors, the MENA program, the Crown Center, the Buffett Institute, that recognize that this period from the late 19th century, the early 20th century, is when we thought to identify what is the key early history to understand Israel-Palestine and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is where we started our timeline. So, so thank you for the question. And Nadim just has the misfortune of having received our invitation to fit himself into the vision that we had. I want to skip to a question from Azal Ozdemir, who was going to be your discussant, Nadim, had you come to person talk for your book talk. I think you guys are going to have a lot of really interesting overlaps, and she's another student finishing her PhD in the history department here. So says, in your work, you bridge local and transnational skillfully. I really enjoyed reading your book. I also want to ask about the global and transatlantic Palestinian identity. I also work on denaturalization and denial of return in the case of Ottoman Armenians in an earlier era, during the reign of Abdulhamid II. The question, was the transatlantic Palestinian community in conversation and solidarity with other stateless Ottoman and post-Ottoman diasporas, such as diasporic Armenians or the Lebanese and Syrians? And I will add there, you and Azal should make a panel together at the next
right.
because you guys are halfway there to a panel connecting these things in really exciting ways.
I wish I knew the answer. I wish I didn't find any evidence in the documents I looked at in Chile of solidarities that go beyond the immediate Arab region, right? So yes, there was a lot of so in each newspaper that I would examine that I examined in the Chilean archive in Santiago, each of the Arab newspapers, there were columns in the different sections of the periodicals, whether it was the Greater Syria, and then there would always be a section separate for Palestine because its developments in Palestine were the most dramatic and most threatening. And then there would be Egypt, and then there would be the Americas. So the Mahja, the abode of migration. So these were sort of seen as the most important zones or the most relevant places to get news from and to report on. Note that they're all Arabic speaking, right? So unfortunately, so yes, while there's constant concern whether it was an earthquake or a drought or anything happening in any part of Greater Syria, they would report on it and say, you know, we need your help. We need the Jalia, the migrant community, to come together and raise funds and send money for this crisis or that crisis. Of course, Palestine ends up, you know, assuming a very important role or taking up a lot of space in these periodicals. But regional things beyond the Arabic-speaking Eastern Mediterranean, unfortunately, I did not find any of those things. But that's a really brilliant question. But that said, you know, the Armenians were in Jerusalem at that point, right after the genocide. They were in Lebanon. They had come to Syria already. So I imagine it would have included them in that sense, right? But in terms of specific things happening in Armenia or outside of the geographic boundaries of Greater Syria, I didn't come across much, but there's always more to dig through for sure.
Thank you. We have 2 o'clock on the dot here in the Central Time Zone. So thank you. As much as you all can give a big virtual round of applause for our speaker, Nadim, I don't know how, yes, their applause coming through the video. I hope you're seeing them and hearing them. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for an incredibly rich and detailed and comprehensive presentation and handling a whole slew of questions. Many of them were not easy. So thank you for handling them with so much grace. And we will see you all next on May 6th for Shai Haskani, who will give a lecture on 1948, the second of our NYU History Posse. So see you all then, and thank you so much for being here.